Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Dee Dee Laugesen, Executive Secretary for the Committee on the Present Danger China. We appreciate your interest in our weekly webinars in which we expose and analyze the Chinese Communist Party's unrestricted warfare against America and the help provided to the CCP in waging that warfare by captured U.S. elites. We encourage you to visit presentdangerchina.org for information on new programs, access to videos of our past webinars, and tons of other very valuable content. Please subscribe to our Substack at presentdangerchina.substack.com and follow us on X at CPD Our moderator today is Frank Gaffney. Frank is president of the Institute for the American Future at usfuture.org. Vice Chair for the Committee on the Present Danger China, and host of Securing America on Real America's Voice Network. Frank?
Welcome, everyone, to this edition of our weekly webinar series sponsored by the Committee on the Present Danger China. These programs are, I like to think, very timely every week because there seems always to be something breaking in terms of China's unrestricted warfare against America, if only you have the ability and interest to ferret it out. But this particular program could hardly be more timely or more topical, because literally within hours of our beginning, President Trump has enunciated a further evolution in his policy approach towards the conflict between Israel and Iran. And as we will be arguing in the course of this program, with inevitably implications for a larger conflict that is the focus of these programs and the committee that sponsors them, namely the Chinese Communist Party. We are going to be addressing today the issue of the relationship between those two nations, Iran on the one hand and Communist China on the other, as they are playing out their hands in this moment of truth for the mullahs of Iran. I say moment of truth because one of the issues that is very much present and that we will be addressing in some detail with our distinguished commentators, presenters, panelists, is whether anything other than the end of the mullahocracy, as I call it, in Iran will suffice, whether one's goal is ending its pursuit of nuclear weapons or its mass production of offensive and dangerous ballistic missiles or its interminable support for terrorism, jihadist terrorism, that is, around the world. We believe very strongly that this question and its attendant implications for China should be very much top of mind as policymakers in Washington quite likely will continue to fine-tune, if not rather dramatically alter, the policies of the United States at this juncture. And we're going to talk a little bit about all of this in the context of a relationship, as I said, that our friend Gordon G. Chang spoke about yesterday with Maria Bartiromo on her Fox Business program. We have a short clip of it, and I thought it would be a good scene setter for the very important comments that will be provided by our distinguished panel in the moments ahead. Let's go to Gordon's video now.
You have a new op-ed on how Israel just ended China's power status in the Middle East. Very interesting.
Yeah, if we go back to March 2023, it looked like China was going to drive the U.S. out of the region. That's the month where China brokered that deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Last year in July, China got 14 Palestinian factions to go to Beijing to sign what's called the Beijing Declaration, the Unity Pact. So we were sort of on the back foot. But with President Trump going to the region last month, that's really triumphal trip, and Israel targeting Iran, which is China's proxy. The Iranians don't think they're a proxy of anyone, but the Chinese think Iran is a proxy. And China's been fully supporting Iran's attack on Israel. So right now, China's policies in the Middle East are just in tatters.
Well, I mean, you might want to, someone referenced this is like Hitler losing Italy during the 1940s. I mean, China losing Iran is a big deal.
It's an enormous deal because China thought that it could drive the U.S. out of the region, could sort of start this momentum around the world that the U.S. was in retreat everywhere, and now it's the Chinese that are having problems. Remember, they've got these proxy wars around the world. They've got Russia and Ukraine. They've got North Africa, those insurgencies that look like wars. They've got Iran and, of course, Pakistan and India last month. They had that 4-day war. China was fully backing Pakistan. Now all of China's initiatives seem to be failing, and that is a real indication that Beijing is in trouble globally.
Right. And as the Israelis win or appear to be winning, it gives more strength to the United States, which is, of course, China's #1 adversary.
If true, and we will explore whether it is, whether it's perhaps premature to be concluding in such an optimistic way. And more to the point, what should America's policies be to have the kind of outcome that Maria and Gordon just spoke of? And conversely, what will be the outcomes if we fail to do so? If we, in fact, with our Israeli allies, lose this conflict with Iran and through its proxy relationship with China. We're going to be exploring all of this, and who better to start with than a man we often turn to summarize and otherwise synthesize the comments that are made in the course of these programs. He is our chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger of China, Brian Kennedy. In his day job, he is also the president of the American Strategy Group, a former president of the highly regarded Claremont Institute, the author of numerous books and pamphlets and essays, including one that just appeared in Claremont's publication, The American Mind. You can find that online at americanmind.org, I believe. It has to do with Iran, Israel, and the Trump doctrine. We've asked him to address a slightly tailored version of that: Iran, the CCP, and the Trump doctrine. Mr. President, glad to have you with us. Mr. Chairman, over to you.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you. And this couldn't be more timely. That essay I wrote is at Frank is right, americanmind.org. And I'm trying to understand really in this essay and trying to present to the conservative world, the MAGA world, a kind of humble reprise of what we used to understand about all these things. None of this is easy. President Trump is taking his time with this. As we know, he's called for a 14-day pause. What he's really trying to do is figure out the real state of affairs here, because it's unclear what that state of affairs is. We were told Iran does not have a nuclear weapons program, hasn't had one since 2003 by Tulsi Gabbard in March in front of the Senate. And anyone looking at this as long as you and I have, Frank, have long believed that not only do they have a nuclear weapons program, but as I'll say, may well already have a nuclear weapon. So President Trump, in taking a step back, is, I think, really following his typical commonsensical kind of approach, which is to say, what is good for the American people first and foremost? Our social compact is with one another as Americans. And so we have to figure out, is this good for us, whatever policies we pursue? I think he also thinks like Churchill, and he has a bust of Churchill behind him quite often when he's visiting foreign leaders in the Oval Office. Churchill said in the 1950s that it's better to jaw than to war. And I was rereading recently Churchill's eulogy for Neville Chamberlain. And he and Neville Chamberlain would fight mightily in the House of Commons, but Churchill also, I think, admired very much in later years Chamberlain's clear desire for peace. And in his eulogy for Chamberlain, which happened, of course, not long into the war, he was sorry that Chamberlain hadn't succeeded in achieving peace. And so as much as President Trump will want peace here, he's also very alive to the fact that the Iranians are in alliance with the communist Chinese and that we have to do something about it. Let me make a couple quick points. One, I think we misunderstand today much of the political world, our relations with Israel. In this essay I described, during the Cold War, it was not controversial that we were on the side of Israel during the Cold War. We admire Israel. They're an outpost of the West. They're defenders of human freedom. But also there's a lot of Americans in this country who think, rightly, that the Jews are God's chosen people. And it may be up to God to save them, but we are not indifferent to that. And we're not indifferent to the outcome of strife with Israel in the region. And as I argue in this essay, that it was the goal of U.S. strategy during the Cold War to have a nation like Israel as one of the hegemons, along with Saudi Arabia, along with Iran under the Shah of Iran, and also Turkey. And we thought even though these countries don't like one another, they could balance each other out. But what mattered was that they were pro-Western. And we were in an existential contest with the Soviet Union. Now, when fast forward to today, a lot of young folks don't think that that mattered, or they don't even know about it, I fear. And, our relations with Israel all these years has partly been about it's us versus them. Us, the West, believers in human freedom, and the totalitarian world led by Russia, then the Soviet Union, and today communist China. And communist China and Russia see Iran as a proxy against the West. Now, why does that matter to us? Well, as we've long described, Iran has been working on nuclear weapons with the North Koreans who work with the Russians and the Chinese. They've been working on that for 40 years. The idea over those 40 years that Iran could not have acquired a nuclear weapon seems a bit far-fetched. They have very capable scientists. They work in concert with the Russians and Chinese scientists in North Korea. The idea that they couldn't have built a nuclear weapon seems a bit absurd. One of the things I highlight in this essay is that first of all, let me just say, the Iranians act like they have a nuclear weapon. It's worth saying. They've sponsored terrorism against the United States. They took our embassy in '79. That was an act of war. 1983, they attacked the Marines using Hezbollah in Beirut, killed over 200 American servicemen, an act of terrorism, an act of war. 2000s, during our war in Iraq, they were killing Americans using Iranian operatives and Iranian munitions, all the while working on this nuclear weapons program. An interesting thing which a lot of folks forget is that in the early 2000s, and again, this was not controversial in defense circles, that the Iranians had tested twice in the Caspian Sea the ability to launch a ballistic missile from a ship in the Caspian Sea. So they had a ship in the Caspian Sea. They had a canister with a ballistic missile in it. They lowered it into the water and fired off the missile. They did this twice. They practiced exploding the warhead in the high atmosphere to simulate an electromagnetic pulse weapon. Now, the only country that they would need to do that to would be the United States. And remember, the United States, they have their children recite, the Iranians do, death to America and death to Israel. And whereas they couldn't build a full-scale nuclear arsenal with missiles capable of going from Iran to the United States, it is more than technically feasible for them to have built ship-launched ballistic missiles to launch off our coast to either destroy American cities or to be used as an electromagnetic pulse weapon. In the scenario that I lay out, they could also sink the ship. And when they sink the ship, we won't know quickly anyway, unless we look at the nuclear signature, we won't know quickly where that nuclear weapon came from. And so we won't know who to retaliate to or retaliate against. And so I mention all that because we're in this proxy war that we've all been talking about, where communist China looks at Iran as one of its proxies. It supports them in their larger terrorist efforts in the Middle East, but also their support of Hamas and Hezbollah, the attack on Israel on October 7th. Iran was working in concert with those forces during all of that, as was Communist China. Communist China gets 16% today of their energy from Iran. The idea that they're not all working together here is far-fetched. I mean, just a casual look at the movements of these people, you can see that they're working in concert. And for everybody in the media today who kind of dismisses all this as just, this is how the world works. Yes, this is how the world works, especially in the totalitarian world, which Iran and Communist China operate with today. We're on the verge of conflict with Communist China in Taiwan, with Taiwan or in Asia more broadly, but also challenging them around the world. If you're Communist China, would you want to launch ballistic missiles directly at the United States and, incur from the United States a retaliatory nuclear attack? No. You'd want to use one of your surrogates, like Iran, to attack the United States. Why wouldn't they? Why have the Chinese been helping the Iranians with their nuclear program? Why have the Russians been helping them with their nuclear program? It's to use them as a proxy against the United States. And so when I think of everything we're going through here with Iran, I'm mindful that yes, the Iranians could attack Israel, and Israel has to make a variety of calculations to make sure that they're secure. But we Americans also need to make calculations, because I believe today they already have nuclear weapons, that it was perfectly within their capability to do. They could have bought them. They could have otherwise got them from Pakistan. And if they do have them, who will be their target? And I would humbly suggest that their first target would not be Israel, but the United States. They know that if they attack Israel with nuclear weapons, that Israel will launch a retaliatory nuclear strike on them and obliterate Iran. Now, Iran in their death throes, it may well come to that, and that is certainly a calculation Israel has to make. But there is also this calculation that if you destroy the great Satan, the United States, Israel will be in a far worse strategic position. Taiwan will be in a far worse strategic position. The entire world, need I say, would be in a worse strategic position. So as we're going through this program here today, Frank, I hope we are mindful that this is not just about relationships in the Middle East that China has, but really that we're in World War III. That Karen Sigeman was brilliant in organizing a series of panels we did last year around the country, where we talked about all these things, including this very point that it is World War III we're in. This is not a new war. This is an old war, and President Trump wants to make sure we win it. And so I look forward to this broader conversation, but with the notion that the war's already started, and the only question now is how do we win it?
Brian, thank you. A perfect send-up for our conversation. And we will be hearing from Dr. Karen Sigeman as the cleanup batter in your stead. So stay tuned for that, please. Before we do, we're going to go to the Middle East, as it happens. for two of our presenters' comments. We have Dr. David Wormser, who has been wending his way there for some days now. In fact, I think was supposed to arrive right about the time that the attack began on Iran a week or so ago. And he has finally made it to Israel. And we've interrupted his dinner, for which we're very grateful for you taking a few minutes. David, you are, of course, a PhD, a naval intelligence veteran, a man who has served with great distinction at the highest levels of the U.S. government, and supportive and Undersecretary of State, a national security advisor, and the Vice President of the United States in your various incarnations. You are these days a senior director with the Center for Security Policy, responsible for its Middle East program, and always an invaluable resource on, in particular, matters like this, where it involves not simply developments and challenges in the Middle East, but a more global perspective. We've asked you to talk about negotiating with the Iranian regime about anything aside from its unconditional surrender will amount to abandoning its victims and perpetuating their enslavement to the benefit of the CCP and to our detriment, among others. Over to you, sir.
There's really two big problems with negotiating with the regime. The first one, in my view, is the one that Prime Minister Netanyahu raised, which is they cheat. They cheat and they lie. They've broken every agreement they've ever entered into, and they won't stop cheating. Despite the fact that for example, the Iran nuclear deal in 2016, or the JCPOA as it's called, there was supposed to have been verification and so forth. Clearly, the onus to deal with cheating is to take appropriate action. But instead, the onus is always on the people who pointed out the cheating, and it's essentially the onus is to come up with a new agreement to bring them in line and validate and codify the cheating, so at least it's, quote, under control, and therefore you can have some modicum of continued management of the situation. And we saw with Iran again and again and again, this doesn't work. Iran simply cheats in these agreements since day one. They have never really abandoned the path to a nuclear weapon, despite the NIE from 2007 or 6, whenever it was, by the United States. And all along, they know how to play diplomacy in such a way that when they need to stop testing something, and they need to go back to do some research on it, then they'll concede that for a little while, and we all think they're moderate and so forth. And they never are. They have had a linear, aggressive, unrelenting attempt to drive toward a nuclear weapon for the last 20 years at least. So that's number one. Number two, the problem with a deal like that is it signals the Iranian people something we shouldn't be signaling them. The Israelis are not in a regime change strategy war. It doesn't matter what some people are saying. The Israelis know they're not in the business of regime change. They are a small country. Iran is a very large country. It's 10 times the size of Israel in terms of population. Israel does not have the military power to take over Iran and install a government to its liking. It cannot do what the United States did in Iraq in 2004. And in many ways, the history of Iraq, the real history, has to still be written. It wasn't the original intent of many people to do it that way anyway. It was, unfortunately, I think there were some actors inside the Bush administration that made it a much more involved nation-building exercise than it should have been to begin with. But that said, we're not talking about Iraq here. We're talking about Iran. And in Iran's case, I think what Israel is doing is, of course, it has its rudimentary military objectives that it has to deal with, which are the nuclear program, the missile program, a whole bunch of nefarious activities by the whole panoply of things that Iran is doing. But the problem is that that in doing that, the Israeli actions to take all that down also involve destruction of C2, destruction of the command and control structure, destruction of a good bit of leadership, and it as a byproduct. And the Israelis have this as an intentional byproduct, but it is not the goal of the war, which is it creates a favorable environment that if the Iranian people want to have a revolution, want to get rid of their government and want to take back their country. And I say take back because everything we see more or less indicates that the Iranians hate their government. If they want to, the Israelis have provided them the best opportunity in generations to do so. And there's every indication the Iranians will grab that opportunity. It will take a little time, but they'll grab it. The problem is the moment you enter negotiations, the Iranian people are scared, because they think that at the end of the day, they will be sacrificed at the altar of another agreement. They have been before. There's no reason for them not to think that they will be. And as a result, what will happen is that the Iranians are going to stay quiet. They're going to wait and see, because the last thing they want is an agreement to be signed on the nuclear issue, even the nuclear and missile issue. And then all of a sudden, they're left high and dry, and the regime, which is horribly weakened, it's lost all its image of omnipotence. It's lost its confidence, and it's shown itself not to be a thug, but really impotent, truly unable to function. Those are death. Those are three pillars of a regime. If failing, it's death for the regime, such as that. And that is where Iran's going. So the Iranian people know that. They're ready to revolt, in my view. But the problem is the moment that we say that we're going to sign a deal, that the end goal of this is a deal, then the Iranian people they realize the government will be left in place, and they will come after them with such a vengeance and cruelty that they have to reestablish their omnipotence, their terror, and their confidence. And that will be paid in the price of Iranian blood. So the Iranians are looking, and they're saying, until we hear clear signs that Israel's going all the way and America will let it, and there won't be an agreement, I don't think the Iranians feel confident enough yet. So, and that's the real wages of constantly dealing with Iran as a normal government, or even as an abnormal government, but as an interlocutor. You validate the government, and that's the currency the Iranian regime always needs to survive. So that is why, in many ways, negotiating with them won't help. It will cause a lot of damage.
Thank you. Excellent presentation, as always. Hope you get back to your dinner and do so safely. We are very, very grateful for your insights, particularly on this question of, is there any downside to carrying on for 2 weeks or whatever period of time President Trump deems necessary to pursue yet again the seeming will of the wisp of a deal with the Iranians. And let me just say in this connection, folks, we did on the 16th of June, under the banner of the Victory Coalition and an organization in Israel called Israel 365 Action, whose executive director we'll hear from next, a very important webinar focused quite specifically on this issue of the state of the multi-front war Israel is engaged in, and the implications of trusting the Iranian regime, or even indulging in the exercise of legitimating the Iranian regime for the outcome of the war, yes, but also for the outcome of freedom in this particular region and stability more widely throughout the Middle East, all of which is in danger by this regime in Tehran. The man I was speaking of is Rabbi Pesach Walicki. He, in addition to running Israel 365 Action, which is a tremendous resource, is the co-host of a podcast called Shoulder to Shoulder and a columnist for the Jerusalem Post. He has contributed to these programs in the past and to our television program, Securing America. And with his permission, we have excerpted a clip from an interview that I conducted with him today that will be appearing, I think, tomorrow morning on the Real America's Voice network. we are delighted to have it. And let me just say, speaking of television, we very much appreciate Fox Business allowing us to make use of that clip from Maria Bartiromo and Gordon Chang to set up, among others, this piece with Rabbi Wolecki. Let's go to his video, please.
Well, what a time to be alive, Frank. You know, the stakes could not be higher in what we're seeing right now. And I want to, you know, before we pull back the camera and talk about those great stakes, you just mentioned, you know, the Chinese involvement in all this and their stake in all of this, which we really cannot take our eye off the ball. That is paramount in what we're seeing here. The gas that flows through the Hormuz into China, 90% of Iran's oil sales fuel the Chinese Communist Party's machine, and in turn, the Chinese Communist Party is the primary flow of cash that supports the Iranian regime and everything that means. So this is really, you know, China is critical here. But I want to just drill down onto that. When we talk about the Red-Green Alliance, that alliance between Marxist, anarchist, atheists on the one hand, and jihadist Islam on the other hand, our mind usually goes to the BLM, you know, protesters, the pro-Hamas left in America when we think of the Red-Green Alliance or things that happen in the streets of Europe. But let's remember that the Red-Green Alliance actually starts all the way at the top with an alliance between the Red Chinese Communist Party and the Sharia supremacist Iran and Qatar. That's the Red-Green Alliance at the, we'll say at the corporate level, at the top. And there's a spiritual component to this Red-Green Alliance, because the Red-Green Alliance, although they seem to be at opposite ends of the theological spectrum, atheists versus jihadist Muslims, they actually share a burning hatred for biblical faith and for everything that biblical faith means. Our civilization is the product of biblical faith. It's biblical civilization. Our moral structure is biblical civilization, and they seek to destroy it. And in the eye of the storm is what happens to the Jewish people, what happens to the people of Israel. What building stood on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago? And do the Jewish people have the right to that land? These are questions that they sound like biblical or historical questions, but they have every impact on geopolitics, because jihad seeks to conquer the world. And you always correctly refer to it, Frank, as Sharia supremacy. I always use jihadist Islam because it's a more popular term, but yours is more accurate, because jihad is really only the process of getting to the end goal. The end goal is Sharia supremacy. So you're absolutely correct. But this Sharia jihadist Islam seeks to control the entire world. Those parts of the world that they're gaining control of by emigration and the democratic process and taking over the culture, like the countries of Europe that are falling into the hands of Sharia, as we see in England, France, and others, and they're starting that process in the Western Hemisphere as well, Epic City and other things that are happening. But Israel, who they can't take over culturally, they can't go through that process, so they attack us kinetically, and you know they're taking over the Western Christian civilization without firing a shot. The only country fighting back on them is Israel, and because Israel recognizes that there's no making any accommodation with this ideology. Western civilization, Judeo-Christian Western civilization, has to show the conviction of being willing to stand up and defend itself. You know, the question is, at what point are you willing to actually fight? And if that answer is just never, because blessed be the peacemakers, and now we have conservative America First Christian Americans who are cheering for the Steve Witkoff wing of the White House, seeking an accommodation with this regime. They're going to call it peace when all it actually is kicking the can down the road and never actually delivering a defeat to Sharia supremacy when we have a once-in-a-millennium opportunity to do so. Everyone in the West knows that, as I said, Islam is threatening the Western world. And here we have an opportunity to deliver it a defeat. You know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt said in World War II that the only option was unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany, of Imperial Japan, to genocidal ideologies. And the only reason that Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan both moderated so quickly is that unequivocal defeat, when the enemy is brought to their knees, it is the only way to really change an ideology, and that is a biblical idea. It's a biblical idea in Psalm 83. Psalm 83 is all about warfare, and it speaks about how the enemies of God seek to undo God's plan, specifically God's plan for Israel. And then it turns into a prayer beseeching God to defeat the enemies. And ultimately, at the end of the psalm, before declaring the final punchline, which is that God should reign over all the earth, there is the final request in the prayer is repeated 3 times, asking God to bring shame upon our enemies, which leads to the question, why do I care if my enemies are ashamed? Isn't it enough just to defeat them? And the answer is I care deeply, because the humiliation of defeat, unequivocal defeat where it's just pure one-sided surrender, which brings shame, means that the enemy is admitting and is recognizing, and all of their followers who were caught up in their ideology are recognizing the error of their ways. Their leaders are submitting, they are surrendering. And that is why unequivocal defeat and surrender actually can break an ideology. And this is not theory. Look at World War II. It worked. So when any Westerner who's worried about Epic City and who's worried about how Islam is taking over the West, recognize that if we have any hope, we're not going to have a world with no Islam. Islam is here to stay. The question is, what does that Islam look like? And if there's any hope of having a reformed Islam, first, Sharia supremacist, jihadist Islam, which is on the march in all kinds of different ways, taking over the West in all kinds of different ways, at kinetic war against Christians in northern Africa, slaughtering them, doing what they did on October 7th every day in Nigeria, doing that to Christians across the world, doing what they're doing to Israel. Sharia supremacy needs to be delivered a blow, a defeat. Now, it won't be the only defeat. We'll still have the Muslim Brotherhood. There will be bad actors. But setting them back and letting it be known that Sharia leaders are brought to their knees in an unequivocal defeat is the only possibility that Western civilization has to start turning this thing around, and to shy away from that moment when it presents itself. And we don't get to choose the circumstances under which it presents itself. That's true. And many Americans have complaints about how Israel handled this and how Netanyahu handled this, and they don't like how Trump got dragged in. Be that as it may. Be that as it may. Right now, the moment presents itself that Sharia could be set back a century or more. And it would be the gravest of sins for us to miss that opportunity.
Well, in addition to that, and that's a spiritual indictment, it would be a booster rocket for the ambitions of the Sharia supremacists, would it not? If they actually emerged victorious. Bloodied, yes. Damaged, yes. But nonetheless, they would have survived, which by definition means they live to fight another day for the destruction of Western civilization, Judeo-Christian civilization. Am I right?
Frank, this brings to mind Sun Tzu's comment. People are famous for quoting, people like to quote Sun Tzu, know your enemy, but the full quote is actually much deeper. Sun Tzu said, if you know yourself and not your enemy, for every victory you think you have attained, you will have attained a defeat. And what that means is that if you're defining victory on your terms, based on what your outcome is, we want to be safe, we want them to leave us alone, but you're not actually thinking about how they define defeat, then they could still not realize they were defeated. That shame I spoke about before, that shame and that humiliation of surrender will never be reached, and nothing will ever change. And they might still define it as a victory. Wherever he winds up, Donald Trump has the opportunity here to either be a part of a grand victory for Western civilization that we've been waiting for 1,400 years, or to kick the can down the road in the long chain of other appeasers who have allowed Sharia supremacy to declare victory.
The greatest of legacies, on the one hand, and unfortunately a legacy that will be shown to have simply set the stage for the next conflict.
And Israel's going to do it, Frank. Israel's going to do it.
I pray they will have the latitude to do it. That's one of the biggest questions here, is whether the United States, having said we're going to take 2 more weeks in pursuit of this deal, will insist upon Israel not continuing to prosecute the war to a decisive victory, which I believe means the end of this regime and the rise of a free Western moderate Shiite country. Thank you for indulging me on some of my comments as well as those of Rabbi Pasqualicki. I think we've really drawn forward this issue of unconditional surrender and whether there is actually any alternative to a decisive victory that includes it and the end of the regime. We're going to explore it a little bit further. And by the way, I neglected to mention that the topic that I think the rabbi has just addressed so powerfully is was given as the implications of a victory for Sharia supremacism in the spiritual and unrestricted warfare battle spaces, the latter, of course, being the one the Chinese are very much engaged in. We have another brilliant, as it happens, member of our Committee on the Present Danger China by the name of George Racely, who is going to take an independent and American view of some of those same topics. He is these days the editor-in-chief of Conservative HQ, Richard Vigory's wonderful online newsletter. He brings to that position a wealth of experience in politics, having been involved in some 300 campaigns, and service in the executive branch, in the office of the vice president, and on Capitol Hill in senior positions as well. George is the man we've turned to talk about what a defeat for Iran would mean in terms of a defeat as well for the Chinese Communist Party, and some related topics as to whether we're going to get to either of those outcomes, looking at America first, looking at a sort of schism that Pasqualicki touched on, inside MAGA, the America Great Again team, and Trump's choice as to how to proceed. Let's go to the video, in this case, with George Racely, please, also taped on our show today.
I think it's important to recognize that the Red China is Iran's #1 trading partner. And 68% of Iran's exports are oil and related products. 5% goes to China. That is a big chunk of the Chinese oil supply, and it's also a supply that's more or less off the books because of sanctions, and so it comes to them at a discount. And it would be very discomforting for the communist Chinese economy to lose that discounted oil supply. And if a democratic, peaceful regime were to replace the mullahs, it would actually help stabilize world oil prices at a lower level, because it would put the Iranian oil supply back on the world market legitimately. And that supply would, of course, as we learned in Economics 101, more supply, lower price. And so there are a lot of benefits there. Additionally, the Chinese have a lot of interchange with the Islamic Republic on matters of terrorism support, all kinds of domestic security arrangements, weapons, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of benefit of getting rid of the Islamic Republic in terms of weakening Red China.
Obviously, the Chinese are, as you know so well, at least for aggression against Taiwan. Would calculation, George, be that if an ally like Iran goes away, that will induce the Chinese to be less aggressive, or do you think they might be more so against Taiwan and us, for that matter?
Probably President Trump's greatest folly is waiting. It gives the theocracy 2 weeks to continue to work on their nuclear weapons. It gives them 2 weeks to further harden wherever those weapons are stored. It gives them 2 weeks to take out potential leaders of a new democratic Iran. And it does nothing to enhance our position should we decide to go to war. And it also gives them 2 weeks to move things here in the United States that we know they have. We know they have hit squads here. We know they have terrorist cells here. And why we would give them 2 weeks to put those terrorist cells and hit squads into motion is astonishing. And I can only believe that, the internal debate in the White House is what has given President Trump pause. There's no real rational explanation for this. I mean, I think the president sees himself as a peacemaker, as a global figure for good, and that's part of his self-image, and I think it's blinded him to the reality that this needs to happen now, and that regime change is the only thing that's going to end Iran's nuclear weapons program.
You have extensive experience with political matters. Let me ask you, I've come to the conclusion that a prime factor in the president's sort of fixation with this idea of being the peacemaker is, shall we say, pressure, or at least the appeal of young people made up of part of the MAGA movement. I've come to call this a children's crusade, in fact, as these kids who seemingly know nothing about, the realities of, the Middle East for the moment, among other things, are so insistently demanding that he stand down. Could you walk us through what this all means for the MAGA movement, as well as possibly this presidency?
I think there's a dichotomy that we have to recognize here, Frank. One is that there's this group of so-called influencers, people who have big followings on X and Facebook and so on and so forth. And they seem to be against any further involvement in the Middle East. They're completely disconnected from the reality that is demonstrated by polling. Every poll I've seen says that, upwards of 60%, in some polls it's 75% plus, that the United States needs to do whatever it takes to eliminate Iran's nuclear weapons program. And so we have these people with outside influence, but minimal understanding, I think, that have the president's ear, and that's a very unfortunate thing.
Thanks again to all of you for indulging me. To yet another of our guests on Securing America earlier in the week, a frequent contributor to these webinars, arguably one of the preeminent naval intelligence officers, certainly of our time, if not all time. His name is Captain James Fennell, United States Navy, retired. He left the Navy from the post of Chief of Intelligence and Information Operations at the U.S. Pacific Fleet. He has an extraordinary record of having warned about the coming threat from the Chinese communists, specifically what he called a decade of concern, in which they would have military might sufficient, perhaps, for them to think that shooting war with us is an option. He's co-authored with Brad Thayer a very important book on the subject, Engaging Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure. And we've asked him to sort of tie in a bit more fully the Chinese element of all of this and how it relates to our vital interests in terms of assuring a victory in Iran that will redound, I believe, to the benefit of the free world vis-a-vis the threat posed to it by communist China. Let's go to this final videotape clip from Securing America.
Spent my career focused on, as we call it, the main thing, the People's Republic of China, and fighting against the Chinese Communist Party, who's at war with us by their own declaration. So that's been the focus of my my professional life for majority of it, but a part of it I spent in the Middle East. I spent 4 months in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia in 1994, and I made a couple of deployments on aircraft carriers into the Persian Gulf throughout my career. But I'm not an expert in it, I'm not a veteran of it, but I will say that we have international interests around the world, and President Trump was very clear when he ran for office, and he said it again yesterday. It's pretty simple. We cannot allow Iran to have nuclear weapons. That's in our national interest. Additionally, we know that Iran has killed Americans, most recently in the October 7th attacks into Israel from Gaza. That was initiated, or not initiated maybe, but sponsored largely by Iran with their money and ideology, and they killed Americans. I also remember back in the 1980s when 200 plus Marines were killed in our embassy in Beirut. So Iran's got blood on their hands for killing Americans. So I have no problem taking out this Iranian nuclear facility. It's in America's national interest, and if we kill a few Revolutionary Guard Corps officers in the process, then that's justified payback for what they've done to lots of Americans. My issue is that we have split the MAGA movement in a way. We're in the process of doing that, and I'm not happy about that. What we need to do is have folks ratchet down on both sides, not accuse one side that doesn't support this as being anti-American and the other side accusing the other of being neocons and wanting endless wars. That's not what President Trump said yesterday. He said it was simple. We can allow them to have nuclear weapons, and that doesn't necessarily mean we're not going to be invading Iran. So these two things can be mutually inclusive. Also, the other main issue for me is, getting back to the People's Republic of China, the main thing is this demonstrates once again, when we start getting upset about moving carriers, is we don't have enough carriers and we don't have enough of our Navy. And in the last 30 years, as we were doing these endless wars in the Middle East, the U.S. Army and their control of the Pentagon essentially allowed for the gutting of the U.S. Navy from 600 ships to 300 ships. So we need to get our priorities right. If we don't want to invade Iran, which we don't, and we don't want to have a land war in Asia, which we don't, then why the hell are we still buying all these Army combat brigade teams that cost just as much or more than a U.S. destroyer in both terms of production and maintenance over a span of a life of an institution? So let's stop building and buying all these Army units. We need some of them, clearly, but we don't need as many as we have at the detriment of having naval ships that can sail around the waters that encompass 70% of this Earth's surface that are hard to find in combat. Not easy to find, as some people are alluding to. So let's get our priorities straight. Let's take care of business in Iran in the way that the president has directed, and let's also have a naval force that can deter the PRC, because they're intending to fight us at sea and defeat us at sea and sink our Navy. And when that's all gone, they can rule the world, and that's their intention. At this point in this process, if the regime in Tehran is allowed to continue and is able to continue, maybe with their nukes or not, but they're going to continue to produce oil that's going to be supplied to the PRC. They're a customer, so they want that oil. That's important for them. So does Russia. Not the oil so much, but Russia and Iran working together to control and influence the oil market is something that they want. And they want to have a proxy there that can continue to poke into the Western civilization, Western world. So it's not good. Plus, we've already come out on and our ally Israel, if they're put in this position where they're continued to be held at risk by somebody like Iran, it sends a signal that America is weak and other areas can be taken, like Taiwan. So we have to be very concerned about that. People that are taking the position against being involved in Iran, you ask them, well, is there anything worth standing up for? Is there anything? And if we won't stand up against Iran's nuclear program, are we going to stand up for Taiwan? Are we to protect them? Hey, they're not Americans, so we won't stand up for them. We'll let them fall. I mean, what's next? Guam, Hawaii? I mean, you get the sense that there's nothing worth fighting for because we're so tired. Well, guess what? I don't like the endless wars in the Middle East either. I've been bitching against it for 30 years because it's come at the expense of our understanding of the rise of the PRC and the influence of communist China. But the fact of the matter is, if we want to survive and be free, we have to do certain things. And we cannot allow Iran to have nukes. That's the bottom line. The president has said that. He said it before he ran for office, so all the libertarians and all those that said that they didn't agree with that, come on now, you're being disingenuous. You heard him say it. You just didn't want to hear it. So it's like you said, willful ignorance, willful blindness. Nobody wants a war. Nobody wants to kill civilians. But the fact of the matter is those people are planning to kill us, and they have killed us. The Iranians have. And the Chinese are planning on doing it. And they want to. They want to take over and run the world. They tell us that. It's not my words. It's their words. And we would be stupid if we sit there and ignored it because we're tired. That's not what happened 80 years ago in World War II, where men went off to fight for 4 years, 5 years in Europe and in Asia. They were tired, but they went back again. They were tired. They went back again. And they faced horrendous odds in some cases. They faced horrendous obstacles and heat and death and all kinds of crazy things, but they had to do what was right. And at the end of the day in World War II, they even had to go to the one step that nobody wanted, but they did it in essence to save millions of more lives. And that's a fact. So I'm not a warmonger. I'm not a neocon. I'm not somebody that's experienced and fought wars in the Middle East. I didn't. I'm somebody that's looked at the main thing in the PRC, and I'm telling you, I don't like it to lose the Nimitz, but we have the GW on station. But the fact of the matter is we're not ready as a nation to deal with these contingencies around the world. And because we are the last great superpower, they want to take us off. This axis of evil of North Korea, China, Russia, and Iran. And we have to deal with that. We can't just put our head in the sand and think it's all going to vanish and we'll wake up and we can go have, brunch and things will be normal. It's not the way the world is. It's never been that way in history. We have to fight sometimes to keep what we want. Just like we have to mow the lawn every week and we have to pull the weeds. We have to cut our fingernails. We have to get a haircut. Things come and go. Life cycle comes and goes, and if you want to live in a civilized world, then you're going to have to defend it.
Amen. And let me just add to what you've said, Jim. It seems to me that many of the arguments that are being made currently to suggest that, Iran is just not our problem, not only fail to recognize what you've said about what it has done to us in the past, to our people, to our servicemen and women, not least in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. But what it says it intends to do to us, and has for 46 years, namely bring death to America, as well as death to Israel. But the arguments that are being made to say, well, never mind, that's not our problem, will surely, as you've suggested, be applied to Taiwan, or perhaps other of our key allies in the region if the Chinese have their way. And I just dread the prospect that this fracturing might prove to be a permanent condition for a movement that is about America at its core. America first, yes, America first and foremost in the world, I think is a an additional fillip that is very much part of the Trump America First movement. It is not the Lindbergh America First movement, which you will recall, Captain Fennell, not that you were alive in that period, but he was a guy who championed precisely what the isolationist wing.
And then he apologized for it after the war started. Lindbergh said, I was wrong. I shouldn't have done that, and it weakened us. And he acknowledged that being an isolationist was a failed endeavor.
Well, there you have it, folks. A voice of considerable intelligence addressing why we must both assure the Iranian regime's defeat and deter the CCP. Finally, our present cleanup batter, we are very pleased to have back with us once again Dr. Karen Sigemund, another very distinguished member of the Committee on the Present Danger of China, the president of the American Freedom Alliance, the founding member of the Sovereignty Coalition, and very active with our Victory Coalition and so much more. She is a thought leader in these matters of war and peace, as well as our culture wars and so much more. I commend to you the resource of her AmericanFreedomAlliance.org, as well as remarks like those that she will be making now on the subject of why defeating evil matters. Any substitute for victory will ensure we are afflicted by much more of it in the Middle East and far beyond. Dr. Sigemund, welcome back. The floor is yours. Cheers.
Frank, thank you so much. And it's really an honor, again, to be part of this august group addressing not only a key issue as you address every week, but the timeliness of this, the urgency of this, the concern, really the global impact of exactly what we're talking about today. It's kind of, it feels unmatched. It feels we're in a uniquely historical moment. As Brian had mentioned, and you, Frank, also, we did have a series of conferences last year, World War III, the early years, addressing the extent to which we have been under attack. And by we, I mean the United States, I mean Israel, I mean essentially Western civilization. And by whom have we been under attack? Again, the topic of our conversation, the red-green axis, the red-green alliance. And one cannot minimize the extent to which we have already been suffering under this war. Yes, it's World War III, but it absolutely has been an attack on Western civilization generally. And by that, I also mean Judeo-Christianity, all nations that have at one time or another, even if they've walked away from it, increasingly becoming secularized, Judeo-Christian values. This has been, between China and Iran and the rest, a war on Western civilization, on Judeo-Christian values, and this is why all efforts are poised right now against Israel as the outpost of exactly this. And you can tell the extent to which an entity feels that something is an important target for them, and that is by the intensity with which they will fight against it. Israel clearly is perceived as a load-bearing wall of Western civilization. It is an outpost of Judeo-Christianity, and therefore draws all the fire that is currently and has been over the decades been drawn at it. You know, in all the conversation that we're having, let's not forget the horror, the atrocities, the inhumanity of the slaughter on October 7th. What is happening right now is a response, it's seemingly, to my thinking, of a long overdue response to that attack. And let's also just give a moment to think about the humiliation and the pathetic nature of the deals that were made with the hostage exchanges. We would get a few hostages back in exchange for several hundred terrorists being returned by Israel. This is how that game is played. This is how negotiations happen. There is no through line. There is no way to contend with Sharia supremacists in conjunction with the CCP, who have as their core, absolutely their core tenet, to destroy Israel, to destroy America, to destroy Western civilization. We see what their negotiations look like. We've seen it over the decades, and we've seen it in particular in relation to October 7th. It is supremely ugly. President Trump has been very clear. Iran cannot get nuclear weapons. That's fantastic. Israel has been very clear in the position that they've taken over this past week. Again, taking the brunt of the violence. We've been talking a lot about proxies. They are proxy for all of us. And a war on Israel is a war on America. It is a war on Western civilization. And to ignore the efforts being made by Israel would truly be a horror. Not that we're doing that, but one sees this in conversation. Why does Israel matter? Israel matters for all of these reasons. We are in a unique moment in time right now. We are poised to win. To pull punches at this juncture not only would be a horror for Israel, but would be a horror on the world stage as they see, and every one of the speakers thus far has made this point, that the world is watching. We cannot withdraw. We cannot reveal any kind of weakness at this point in time. Peace through strength is just as true as war through weakness. To evince any kind of weakness would be to signal, first of all, would be to let Iran win, and it would be to signal, as other speakers have said, a lack of seriousness, a lack of commitment to the preservation of Western civilization. Israel must be supported, and we must be in a position to do that. I think to defend Israel is to defend Western civilization. The converse is also true. God has been on our side since before our inception. And I think that that is true because we have been on his. We must make every effort to continue to be on his so that he continues to be on ours and on the side of Israel and on the side of Western civilization. It would be an absolute travesty if such were not the case, if we squandered this opportunity, if we squandered the sacrifices that have already been made. Now is absolutely not the time to do that. Given that there is this red-green axis, this red-green alliance, the axis of evil, as James Fennell has said, we must absolutely be the ones to stand up to that evil. It does fall to us. They recognize that it falls to us. That is the position that the United States and Israel have always taken, and I don't think we can walk away now. And I really think that the conversation that we're having here today is among the most important. The notion of red-green axis, the red-green alliance, the fact that Xi and Khomeini, that Iran and the Chinese Communist Party, that Islam and communism, the extent to which they are allied is something too many people, almost everybody, is completely unaware of. And even if China weren't allied with Iran, they are watching the fact that they are allies, and Iran is a proxy and Israel is also a proxy. People need to be very aware of. And as we go forward in the next, I hate seeing these next 2 weeks. I'm not happy that that's on the table. On the other hand, I'm pretty confident that President Trump absolutely understands the stakes, is not particularly willing to kick the can down the road, but does want to feel that he's done everything possible before the next step is taken. I'm fairly confident that he understands it, and I hope to bring the American people along. And I do hope that this MAGA divide is that peace is somehow made, and that there is a recognition that supporting Israel is also supporting the United States and is part of making America great again.
Thank you, Karen. Very well said, as always. We have time, I think, for a question to each of you before we run out of the allotted hours. Thank you to both of you for staying with us and taking questions aboard. Brian, one of the things that is particularly vexing as we try to sort out the way forward here is an extraordinary statement that the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, made to the Congress back in March, which has now been repeated like some kind of incantation, to the effect that the United States intelligence community has concluded that Iran does not have a nuclear weapons program. Hasn't since, I think, 2003, in fact. And given what's been said here, given what's been said by the Israelis, given what's been said even by the International Atomic Energy Agency, for heaven's sakes, how are we to make sense of the position of the U.S. Intelligence professionals as represented in that congressional testimony by Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard?
Yes, Frank, that's a great question. Well, look, this is the same intelligence community that said Donald Trump was a Russian agent. So forgive me if I think that much of what they produce is highly politicized. And this is an intelligence community inherited by the Biden administration, which was historically anti-Israel, as much of the left is, and pro-Iranian. Everyone talks about the Israeli lobby. What about the Iranian lobby and their ability to influence how the U.S. thinks about them? Let me just say, though, something, Frank, that an attack on Israel is not an attack on the United States. And I think we have to be careful that when we're talking to the American people, we make clear that what we do for the benefit of the United States. We are a funny kind of people. We love freedom. We love Israel. We love the Jewish people. But I'd almost say we love the Jewish people more than we love Israel. We believe the Jews are God's chosen people. Not all Americans believe that. Certainly a large percentage do, but not everyone does. But because something happens to Israel, we have to be very careful to explain to the American people that what we're doing when we do it, if we do it, is good for the United States. And Americans don't like to be told that they have to go defend some people in a far-off land, even if they're fond of them. We have our cousins in England, but our cousins in England are different than the United States. Our friends in France are different than the United States. The same is true of Israel, even if we have this long tradition of believing they're God's chosen people. We also think God's going to look out for them too. And so we have to be mindful that a lot of what goes on here has to be explained to the American people in a way that demonstrates clearly this is for the good of the United States. As I was suggesting, and related to your question about Tulsi Gabbard, they have been working on nuclear weapons. They probably developed on their own nuclear weapons. The Iranians could have bought nuclear weapons from either North Korea or Pakistan. They could have been transferred to Iran as a matter of high strategic priority by Communist China or Russia to Iran to intimidate the United States. I myself am pushing this, or pushing the more, let's call it, aggressive stance toward dealing with Iran, not advocating an attack in any way, because I believe they can launch a ballistic missile from a ship at the United States and destroy us. Let me finish this little rant, Frank, by saying that I would associate myself with the Steve Witkoff wing of the White House, because the Steve Witkoff wing is the president's wing of the White House. Steve Witkoff has been sent over there by the president to negotiate. He's been given clear outlines from the president. He is not advocating his positions. He's advocating the president's positions. And so President Trump has said Iran cannot acquire a nuclear weapon, as we've said dozens of times just on this webinar. But he also wants to negotiate and see what kind of deal can be struck, if it can be struck. And of course, it was Steve Witkoff who basically got us to the point where we are today. And holding the line, the Iranians have been the ones who have stepped away from the table. It's not been Steve Witkoff keeping us at the table. It has been the Iranians walking away from the tough stance that President Trump, through his ambassador of sorts, Steve Witkoff, has presented to them. So let's remember here that President Trump he has a large amount of intelligence before him that he is sifting through. This 2-week pause, I don't think it's necessarily designed or absolutely designed simply to allow for greater negotiations, although I think he would like negotiations to occur. It may be these are preparations as well for what a strike on their nuclear facilities would look like. We have not prepared, it would appear, to be able to do this in an effective way. There's open debates now of how many bunker buster bombs it would take to degrade that facility at Fordo. Is it 1, 3, 5, 10? That number was thrown around this morning. And so my guess is the U.S. military, just to give the president all the options, is figuring out what such a strike would look like. That doesn't mean the president wants to do that, but he may be put in a position where that's his only choice. And I think rather he would like to see some kind of peaceful negotiation if that's possible. But at minimum, we have to prepare, and that may be the reason for the 2-week delay.
We've talked about throughout this program is that one aspect of the negotiations that Steve Witkoff is leading and that the president is giving another 2 weeks to conduct, at minimum, I guess, is this question of legitimating the people who are running this regime in Tehran instead of the people who have been oppressed by them, and I think are our best hope for a good outcome here. So we may have a small disagreement on the wings of the White House and the policies that are emanating from them at the moment, but I think we've helpfully illuminated the choice really that is before President Trump. And Karen, I just wanted to come to you as a person who has spent much of her professional life after helping win the Cold War, I might add, against Soviet submarines, where you played a direct role in trying to help our Navy contend with that threat. As in your post-defense-related service, an educator at every level, I think it's correct to say, you have an understanding of the state of America's youth and what they have been exposed to, what has been inculcated in them. And I'm hoping that you might be able to further shed light on this concern that I mentioned with, I think, 2 of our guests, that a very powerful force apparently now in this MAGA movement and in advancing some of these policies, which Brian is a little more favorably disposed towards than I am, are young people who I fear have not been very well equipped to understand the specifics of the circumstance that we're confronting now with these mullahs and with their taqiyya, with their 12-er apocalyptic agenda, and on and on. But could you just, having given some serious thought to, and I understand writing a book about national security and education, how that is factoring in to what is happening within the MAGA movement at the moment, I guess, but also how it is perhaps contributing to some of the policy choices the president is making now.
Great. Important question, Frank. You noted that our youth of today are not potentially not well equipped to deal with this, what's going on. I would say that they're being extraordinarily well equipped to advance the narrative that is not related to the actual reality. Our youth, our students over the last couple decades have been really victims of an unbelievably successful campaign of propaganda against Israel and against America, pro-China. All they know about Islam is that it's a religion of peace. All they know about China is there was some kerfuffle some years ago, but it's all fine now. Communism is fairer, and they're living with everything to do with, quote, fairness, with DEI and so on. These are all Marxist lines of attack and Marxist narratives. So everything that they know supports all the narratives that the Committee on the Present Danger, everything that we're talking about, it all supports the very threat that we are trying to level set against, as you say. Between the Qatari money and the CCP money go into our universities and our schools at all levels. Plus, at this point, just being pro sort of communism light, but through the long march through the institutions, all of our institutions have been captured by individuals, by narrative. So everything that they know essentially is wrong. Is to have Israel painted as genocidal, to have Israelis, Jews painted as Nazis, to have Trump painted as a Nazi, to have absolutely everything that's good reflected as evil, everything evil reflected as good. They feel very strongly that it is the right thing to do, it is the moral thing to do, to stand up to Israel, which we saw October 8th, 9th, 10th, and so on, and we're seeing this now. And this is what is inflaming, in a sense, the portions of the MAGA movement, that there's a sense that if all of our students, our college students, are incipient adults, believe the way that they do, there is a sense that maybe they need to be coddled to, catered to, pandered to, that is truly horrifying. But that we've seen this coming up with such as, I don't know if the word is assiduousness, but there's been a real determination on the part of Islam and communism to misinform our students, and we see this through our media as well.
Just a final point on that, the media in particular, that seems to be especially influential with our young cohort. That's relevant, of course, to the mission of our Committee on the Present Danger China, namely warning about the threat we face from that quarter, is TikTok. And could you just say a word about the fact that apparently has become a prime and trusted news source for young people in this country? They say about half our population is now hooked up, and I mean hooked on TikTok. What role is that playing in shaping these kinds of perceptions about both, China and Israel and us, for that matter?
And us, for that matter, too. I think that's a really important point. Yeah, TikTok, its influence is completely, it's a terrifying, yet another, again, line of attack. And given that it's coming from China, and given that China has declared a people's war on us, and given that we're seeing unrestricted warfare from every avenue and in every possible vector coming in to our country, of course TikTok is yet another massive weapon against our kids. Not only does it demoralize in terms of what America is, it deals with attention span, it fabricates an entirely different set of, it's a reframing, it's a recreation of a false reality. And our kids are not living in a world that is in fact the real world, and the decisions that they're making are based on pure fabrications. This is not a good thing, especially when what is good, the moral inversion that they are trying to address, plus it's utterly demoralizing. TikTok is just one of 1,000 ways that they're getting at our kids. And I think we need to just consider the entire array of weapons directed at us, of which TikTok is just one of countless.
Indeed. Sigamon, Brian Kennedy, thank you very much, as well as to all of our other colleagues, Captain Jim Fennell, George Racely, Bezek Walicki, David Wormser, and with brief clip from him, Gordon Chang as well. We're deeply grateful to each and every one of you for taking time to address this topic at this particular juncture, very much in the hope that it will inform not only those of you listening at the moment and those of you that will listen in the days ahead through our subscription option at Present Danger China, but also our policymakers who seem very much in need, to varying degrees, of course, of calibration on just how dangerous would be an outcome in which the jihadists, the Sharia supremacists of Iran, their mullahs, come away from the present moment surviving and therefore deeming themselves and being deemed by other Sharia supremacists, by the way, as victorious. Bad for us, bad for Israel, of course, bad for the Middle East, but especially as it might redound to the benefit of the Chinese communists, bad for the entire planet, as this would mean a further impetus behind the efforts of the Red-Green Alliance. I throw in the globalists on top of it, the totalitarian trifecta, if you will, all of which have in mind becoming our successors as the leaders of a new world order. They have the differences amongst each other, to be sure, and they will sort it out if we're gone, but they are working together right now to bring that about. And this moment in Iran is, as I think Bezek Walicki called it, a millennial moment, a choice, an opportunity. And I pray that President Trump will see the imperative need to stick to what he has said is his required outcome. And that would be unconditional surrender by the mullahs of Iran. And not just with respect to their nuclear capabilities, by the way, but I believe to their hold on power. Leaving the legacy of this president, the greatest one imaginable, the one that I think he deserves and the one that I know we all need. And that is the liberation of the people of Iran and a signal defeat for the Sharia supremacists who have repressed them for so long and seek our destruction as well. With that, we will turn it back to Didi Laugesen with my thanks and my prayer that you will all go forth and multiply.
Thank you, Frank, and thanks to all of you for being here. A video of this webinar will be posted to presentdangerchina.org within a day of our program's conclusion. Please share this and our other programs with your elected representatives, colleagues, family, and other networks. For webinar notices, updates, and news, subscribe to our Substack at presentdangerchina.substack.com and follow us on X at CPD China. Join us again next week for another installment of our Committee on the Present Danger China webinar series on the CCP's unrestricted warfare against America and the free world, and how CCP captured elites betray the USA. Thanks for joining us. Goodbye.